Hi, I'm author Stephen McGee, and I wrote the book Health Forensics and Hypoxia, Mental Illness and Chronic Fatigue. There I am, I'm at the top of Mauna Kea. I'm standing on top of the world's largest telescopes, the W.M. Keck Observatory. And we have a cloudy day up there, and that is the Subaru telescope. So here to talk about toxic altitude, and that's me. It's the world's largest telescopes, the W.M. Keck Observatory, and we're on top of Mauna Kea on a nice sunny day. So today we're going to talk about a chapter called altitude sickness. So you'll find this on page 137 of Toxic Altitude. So let's take a look into this and see what we find. So altitude sickness. Hypoxic altitude sickness comes in different flavors. These are acute mountain sickness, AMS for short, occurs when a lowland person ascends to high altitudes. The higher the altitude, the worse the sickness becomes. The diagnosis is a headache plus one other symptom. So the next one is central sleep apnea. So that's CSA for short. It occurs higher than 6,500 feet above sea level. And the diagnosis is breathing issues during sleep. So chronic mountain sickness, CMS, also known as Mung's disease. So for some reason they've changed the name of this disease from Mung's disease. So Mung was the guy who discovered it. It's now called chronic mountain sickness. Same thing, no difference. Occurs when a person lives too long at high altitudes. The higher the altitude, the more prevalent it becomes. So this is something that occurs in people when they've stayed at high altitude for too long. And it's a pretty nasty condition. The diagnosis is altitude sickness and I can't even say that. It's polyerythremia. Let's call it PEH. That's a lot easier. So altitude hypersensitivity. So that's me. We're talking about me now. So this is new. You will know. You won't find this in altitude sickness definitions, but this is a new definition and should start appearing in the coming years in altitude sickness lists. So altitude hypersensitivity, AH for short, occurs when a person becomes sensitized to altitudes higher than sea level. This is a new emerging disease. Diagnosis, altitude sickness symptoms below 4,900 feet and or itchy skin. So when I was defining this disease, I noticed during some of the testing it caused itchy skin. And it's actually quite painful, itchy skin, because it can be all over the body, and it doesn't appear to subside for maybe like days. I had it for days when I had it. It's like really bad for a day during the testing, and it took days to actually fully subside. So there's something about this condition, this altitude hypersensitivity, that causes itchy skin to occur. And basically you get altitude sickness much sooner than the rest of the population, and it occurs at a definite altitude. So my altitude for altitude hypersensitivity is 1,000 feet. So I am a prisoner of sea level. I have to stay living at sea level because I have altitude hypersensitivity. And it starts showing up in really bad ways above 1,000 feet above sea level. So, long COVID. So, this is a sign of the times we're in. Long COVID's on the list. So, why is long COVID on the list? Occurs when hypoxia damages the human body. It may progress pre-existing hypoxia damage in people with previous high altitude exposures. This is a new emerging disease. So, we're all along on this long COVID ride, seeing what it is and what it's going to emerge as a treatment for it. But yeah, kind of, if you've had long COVID, or you've had COVID and it's progressed into long COVID, you may actually be experiencing some aspects of altitude sickness. So you damage the body and you change the way the body interacts with altitudes. So that's what we're talking about there. Okay, McGee's disease. Oh, guess what? My name is McGee. So I developed this disease. McGee's disease, this is a new and emerging disease. Let's see what it is. A high altitude commuting disease. This is a new emerging disease. So the key here is commuting. So I'm a high altitude commuter. I commuted to high and very high altitudes for a decade, and I was very, very sick after that, and that sickness progressed into disabling sickness, and I eventually characterized it into this McGee's disease. So I wrote a book, it's actually called McGee's disease, that talks about it. So the diagnosis is altitude sickness and or systemic virus damage and or lung sensitivities and or shift work disorder and or loss of circadian rhythms and or organ damage and or systemic deficiencies and or malnutrition. So yeah, kind of the treatment for McGee's disease in me is very based around treating malnutrition. So for some reason my body is in a state of malnutrition, and if I fill it with supplements, nutritional supplements, the condition of McGee's disease subsides. So it doesn't fully clear up, but it significantly improves. So still emerging, but it's definitely in the population, because there's another person I know that has this condition of being sensitized to altitude. So it's what we talked about earlier, it's altitude hypersensitivity. So altitude hypersensitivity is part of McGee's disease. Okay, there are 5 different ranges of altitudes that altitude sickness falls into. So let's see what the 5 ranges are. So the start is sea level, a damaged body in a state of altitude sickness at sea level. Acclimatization never occurs. So this is definitely in the population. There's no doubts that people are getting altitude sickness at sea level. And it's most commonly documented as reverse altitude sickness. So people up on mountains, they get acclimatized to the mountain, they come down to sea level and they get really sick down at sea level. And that's called reverse altitude sickness. So they have the opposite effect. So they feel okay on the mountain, acclimatized to the mountain, but then they can't feel good at sea level. So that's reverse altitude sickness. And it's also probably people with damage to the body from things like COVID or prolonged altitude sickness, such as like McGee's disease. So there's definitely a group of people that are getting altitude sickness at sea level. So we've got the damaged body in a state of altitude sickness at sea level, acclimatization never occurs. So they're constantly in a state of altitude sickness at sea level. So number 2 is altitude hypersensitivity. So that's me. So I actually tend to feel okay when I'm down at sea level, but as soon as I get above 1,000 feet, I start to feel lousy with altitude sickness symptoms. So altitude hypersensitivity above sea level to 4,900 feet. Acclimatization only occurs below the altitude hypersensitivity threshold, where symptoms are not observed. So that happens below 1,000 feet in me. So above 1,000 feet, I start showing all kinds of weird sickness symptoms. Number 3, high altitude. So this is the official start of traditional altitude lists. So when you look into altitude sickness right now, you'll find the list starting at number 3. So they don't talk about number 1, they don't talk about number 2. So if you go onto the internet and Google altitude sickness, it will start talking about altitude sickness here. So this is the official start of altitude sickness. High altitude, 4,900 to 11,500 feet. And then number 4, it gets more severe the higher you go. So there's a very characteristic crossing into very high altitude sickness that occurs above 11,500 feet. And it's all the way through to 18,000 feet. And then above 18,000 feet, we get this number 5, extreme altitude sickness. So, extreme altitude sickness. The thing with extreme altitude sickness is generally widely acknowledged that if you stay there, you may actually die. So, all kinds of weird stuff starts happening in the body above 18,000 feet. And it's killed a lot of people who've stayed there. So, yeah, kind of you start getting weird things like the gastrointestinal system starts shutting down. You can't digest food, and you just start feeling really lousy. And pretty much every organ system starts to have problems above 18,000 feet. Now, organ systems are having problems at these lower altitudes, but it becomes pretty much fatal with long-term exposure above 18,000 feet. So you might get away with the organ damage, and you may end up with some of these, like McGee's disease, from that organ damage if it's permanent. So there's only so much you can get away with before this damage is not recoverable from, and you may end up with a condition like McGee's disease. Okay. So as you can see, the sickness gets worse the higher you go. The range of illnesses that altitude sickness causes are gastrointestinal, loss of appetite, nausea, stomach illness, vomiting, excessive flatulation. Nervous, weakness, headache, dizziness, lightheadedness, confusion, pins and needles sensation, hallucinations, seeing things that are not there. I've had that. Visions, commonly of another person that may help them. That's common in mountain climbers. A sensation that a person is in the room with them, their invisible friend. I've had that. I had it for years. It lasted for many, many years. I don't have it today, but for many, many years I had an invisible friend, and it cleared up when I started figuring out that I had hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue, and I started figuring out how to treat it. So, yeah, that was coming out of an untreated hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue event in me, the invisible friend. So I actually quite miss my invisible friend. I enjoyed having them around. I got used to them being there with me the whole time and helping me out and stuff. So it was an interesting experience, and I'm quite sad that I no longer have my invisible friend. I do miss my invisible friend. Hearing, tinnitus, locomotory, peripheral edema, swelling of hands, feet, and face. So that's very common at altitude. You know, people just start swelling up like balloons. They'll have to unbuckle the belts and untie the shoelaces, and it's a little bit like being on a plane. The kind of stuff you have to do on an airplane. You start getting this swelling of the hands, feet, and face. Respiratory, nose bleeding, breathlessness, shortness of breath upon exertion. Cyanosis. So for people who don't know what cyanosis is, that means you're going blue. So you're going hypoxic. Your blood is going oxygen deficient, and oxygen deficient blood makes you appear blue to people. So you always start looking blue. So it's pretty. I've never actually seen somebody in that condition, but it's pretty nasty to see somebody looking blue, particularly when they're struggling to breathe. Cardiovascular, persistent rapid pulse, palpitations, dilation of veins, dehydration, thickened blood. And one of the things to be aware of with thickened blood is it can cause all kinds of problems in the body. It can lead to like heart attacks and strokes and stuff. And anything that a clot, it can cause clotting, and anything that damage that a clot can do, thickened blood can cause that to occur, because once your blood's thickened, the next step is blood clots. Okay, so increased blood cell production. So that's what thickens the blood. So your blood thickens because more blood cells are in it and less plasma. So you got less blood plasma and you got more blood cells. So you got thick blood. So you got this soup flowing through your arteries and veins instead of this nice free-flowing fluid that we call blood at sea level. So it turns into soup at altitude. So energy, fatigue, tiredness, malaise. So I was in this state for a long time while I had hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue. I noticed the onset at the Keck Observatory in Hawaii. I was doing night shifts, and I was just horribly fatigued day and night. Even on my days off, I was horribly fatigued. I was just had all this fatigue, tiredness, malaise. There wasn't a lot getting done on my days off. I was much happier just laying there fatigued on the couch or in bed. So I've had all this from, and I saw the onset at the Keck Observatory, and actually saw something similar to this that I call descent fatigue. So it happens when you descend from the mountain. So you've been on the mountain all day, you come down, and you get all this in the evening. You just want to sit on the couch. You're not even really that interested in watching TV or anything. You just want to lay there all tired and fatigued. And I call that descent fatigue, so it has all this. So definitely, all this changing of altitude definitely affects your energy levels. So radiation sickness is my favorite. I actually run a company called Environmental Radiation, LLC, and this is how I got into it. I started researching radiation sickness. So when you're on top of these mountains, high, very high, and extreme altitudes, you're on your way into space. And space is a very high radiation environment. So what you can't see in that picture is a very high radiation environment. It's much higher than sea level. It's got all kinds of weird radiation in that environment. So let's see what it does. So increased brightness, increased ionizing radiation, increased ultraviolet radiation, increased infrared radiation, increased radiation from mountain radio frequency antenna parks, increased radiation from airplanes and satellites, increased radiation from space, increased radiation from loss of the tree canopy. Yeah, see, there's no trees, there's no vegetation, it's just a barren landscape. It looks like the moon, the top of Mauna Kea. There's just hardly anything growing up there. And this leads us into this one, increased radiation from reflections. So what people don't realize vegetation is doing is it's preventing reflections from occurring. So vegetation calms all this reflectivity down. So there's a lot of reflections around these telescope facilities, particularly that one that's almost like a mirror. It kind of glows when the sun hits it in the right direction. Possible interference radiation. So interference radiation is where the light gets split up and then it recombines. So that's interference radiation. It causes all kinds of strange effects. Most people will know it as like puddles of oil in the rain that have rainbows in them. That rainbow is interference radiation. Electromagnetic interference from electrical, electronic, and wireless products. That's most definitely happening. Radiation deficiency. So we've gone from radiation sickness, so you're getting too much radiation, to radiation deficiency. So let's see, where's radiation deficiency coming from? So this is too little radiation. Reduced levels of some types of radiation when indoors. So this is a big problem for like night shift workers, people that avoid sunlight. So if you're a person who habitually avoids sunlight, you may go into this radiation deficiency. It's pretty prevalent in night shift workers. Sleep, insomnia, trouble sleeping, sleep disturbance, central sleep apnea, bruxism. So bruxism is grinding your teeth. So I've had all this. It's like prevalent in high altitude astronomy. So it's a plague in the workers, this trouble sleeping. It's particularly bad in the night shift workers. The night shift workers, they have chronic versions of this. This is mild. It occurs in the day shift workers, but it's much more severe in the night shift workers, particularly because some of the night shift workers sleep on the mountain. Severe conditions, high altitude pulmonary edema. It's also called HAPE, fluid-filled lungs causing suffocation. Symptoms similar to bronchitis, persistent dry cough, fever, shortness of breath, even when resting, pink and frothy sputum, progresses rapidly and is often fatal. Diagnosis, dyspnea at rest, plus cough, riles, fever. So they have very noisy breathing, and it's quite often accompanied with foaming at the mouth. So the treatment is descent, oxygen administration, and nifedipine. So And this is the key thing here, descent. All altitude sickness is treated primarily by descent. That is the primary treatment for altitude sickness. It doesn't matter what kind of altitude sickness you have, you descend when you develop the symptoms. If you don't descend, you may die. You may get permanent damage to your body if you don't descend. So oxygen administration will get you by as an emergency treatment until you can descend. And so will the drugs. And I've never seen anybody taking this drug in the high altitude astronomy field. Their drugs are quite different. They're just telling people to take things like aspirin and ibuprofen and gastrointestinal medications and stuff. I've never seen an altitude sickness drug in the medicine cabinet in high altitude astronomy, which I find quite strange. So they tell them to, these people up on top of Mauna Kea, they're being told to treat their altitude sickness with over-the-counter medications, not altitude drugs that are recognized to the altitude industry. So they're all taking the wrong medications up there. So that's very, very interesting. And I'm not too sure how legal that is. Maybe an illegal activity, I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't comment too much on that. So yeah, certainly oxygen is a prescription drug, according to the medical profession. You need a doctor's prescription to take it. So they're certainly on Mauna Kea. They're not descending, which is the treatment. So they stay there. They take the oxygen to stay there, which is medical oxygen is an RX only prescription drug. It needs a doctor's prescription. Nobody has a doctor's prescription up there. And they're taking these altitude sickness drugs. So we're going to talk about some more of these drugs that are used in altitude sickness. So they don't take any form of altitude sickness drug. What they do is they take standard over-the-counter medications that you'll find in the drugstore. High altitude cerebral edema, HACE. So this is kind of what's going on in the workers up on Mauna Kea. So brain swelling causing loss of brain function. There's no doubts these people at top Mauna Kea are losing their brain functioning. It's called summit brain. The management team calls it summit brain. I never heard that term till I worked on top of Mauna Kea, and I heard the management team talking about this summit brain that all the workers develop. So what is high altitude cerebral edema? Headache that does not respond to analgesics. A steady gait, increased nausea and vomiting, retinal hemorrhage, so that's the eyes. Visual impairment, again it's the eyes. Bladder dysfunction, bowel dysfunction, loss of coordination, paralysis on one side of the body. Now that's kind of interesting because as I've aged, I've actually developed nerve issues which are only in the right side of my body. Yeah, kind of interesting that, isn't it? So a long-term high altitude worker develops nerve damage on one side of the body, which is kind of consistent with this. I've had lots of summit brain, so I had no shortage of summit brain on top of Mauna Kea. Gradual loss of consciousness can lead to coma or death. Diagnosis, AMS plus neurologic symptoms. Treatment is the big one, descent. The treatment, as always, for altitude sickness is to descend. It's the primary treatment for altitude sickness. You don't want to stay there. Oxygen administration and dexamethasone. So that's another altitude drug. I've never seen it on top of any mountain I've worked at. I've worked on top of 3 mountains around the world, and Mauna Kea was the highest. And I can tell you I've never seen this drug in the drugs cabinet. Never even heard of it until I started doing all this research. But it's a common drug for mountain climbers. Mountain climbers carry it with them, typically. So they're not on top of this mountain. They're developing the summit brain that has a lot of these symptoms. The treatment is descent. They don't descend. They stay there. And they treat it with oxygen, which is an RX-only prescription medical drug that you need to get from a doctor. And they treat it with this drug, and I believe that's a prescription drug. So that's not on the mountain. So in absence of having this drug on top of Mauna Kea, what they do is they take over-the-counter medications to replace that drug. So you can see that this summit brain The summit brain has a lot of the characteristics of this high altitude cerebral edema, but they're not doing the treatment for cerebral edema. They don't descend, and they don't do the dexamethasone. They do the oxygen administration without a prescription, and there's no guidance from a licensed doctor for how to do it. They're just showing the cylinders at the facility and say, please use them when you develop summit brain for 10 or 15 minutes, and that'll clear it out. It doesn't fully clear it out, but it helps to clear it out, but you still have some lingering effects of summit brain after you've done the oxygen treatment. You feel a little bit better afterwards with the oxygen. But I call it the magical medical gas, because that's exactly what they're using it for. They're using it to keep the workers at the summit, to do a full working day. So these workers may do the oxygen treatment a few times a day. So it's intermittent oxygen administration is what they're doing. So I believe this oxygen administration is continuous for this particular condition of the brain. So they're doing a very different treatment to what is detailed in this book for this brain condition, atopmonarchia, even though the brain condition appears to be very similar. So prevention of altitude sickness is not to venture to high altitudes. Things that can influence altitude sickness effects are rate of ascent, altitude attained, amount of physical activity at altitude, individual susceptibility. There's definitely an individual component to altitude sickness. Not everybody experiences it the same. Alcohol, pre-existing health conditions, and most people in their 40s in the USA, and in fact it's getting younger, most people in their 30s have pre-existing health conditions in the USA. And it's getting so bad now that even the kids coming out of school have pre-existing conditions in the USA. A lot of them are on drugs by the time they're adults. Prescription drugs, that's what we just talked about. So yeah, prescription drugs are going to affect how your body interacts with altitude. Sleeping altitude, so where the height you sleep at, is going to affect how severe the sickness is. Sleeping pills, you don't want to do sleeping pills at altitude. Drugs, yeah, you don't want to be doing drugs at altitude. Sleep apnea, so if you've got sleep apnea, it's generally going to get worse when you go to altitude. Sleep deprivation, yeah, I can attest that. I used to do almost like 2-week-long night shifts atop Mauna Kea, and the more sleep deprived I became on those night shifts, the more severe the sickness would become. Malacclimatization, so pretty much everybody is malacclimatizing to Mauna Kea. I've never seen the acclimatization that they tell the workers to do documented in a book anywhere. It doesn't fit any established protocols that I have seen for acclimatization. That's why they all develop the summit brain, because they're malacclimatized. Contaminated air. So there's a lot of contaminated air up here. They're messing around with all kinds of weird industrial gases. They're just releasing them into the indoor environment. Same with the oxygen. So when they're breathing out the oxygen, that all goes into the environment, and that's hazardous to breathe. There's also a fire hazard. And that place has been on fire. That Subaru telescope there, that went on fire. Killed a bunch of people. So it had some... I think it's definitely had like 2 nasty accidents, and a bunch of people had to go to the hospital, and some people died. Diarrhea. Yeah, everyone's favourite. I know a few people with diarrhea in astronomy. Radiation sickness, so we've already spoken about that. Abnormal radiation exposures from man-made sources. Okay, so what's this about? Abnormal radiation exposures from man-made sources. So we're kind of talking about electromagnetic fields from like maybe antenna parks, radio transmitters in the vicinity, and just kind of like stuff coming off wiring and stuff around the facility. There's a lot of strange products inside of these facilities. I'm not even sure they've ever been tested for electromagnetic field emissions. They're just made and put into service. So abnormal radiation exposure from man-made sources. So we're also talking about like satellites, and space is getting heavily polluted right now from satellites, and the more satellites that are up there, the more toxic places on top of high altitude mountains are becoming, because the signal strength is much higher on top of these mountains. So kind of like stuff from space is and airplanes flying over. So once altitude sickness starts, descending to sea level and drinking fluids is the recommended treatment. So okay, that does not happen on this mountain. And it doesn't happen at any mountain that I've ever worked on. So I've worked in La Palma, worked in Kitt Peak in Arizona, and Mauna Kea in Hawaii. I've never seen people doing this unless they've fainted. People do faint up there. So once altitude sickness starts, descending to sea level and drinking fluids is the recommended treatment. So that the only people I've seen get that treatment are people who faint. So there's plenty of drinks up there, so people are definitely drinking fluids, but nobody descends to sea level to treat the altitude sickness. Daily commuting to high altitudes causes malacclimatization to occur and may bring on chronic mountain sickness, McGee's disease, or altitude hypersensitivity. It is undesirable to regularly commute to high altitude, so I don't recommend anybody do altitude commuting. So, and some of the high altitude commuters kind of obscure. I mean, one of the things that emerged when I looked into high altitude commuting is truck drivers. Truck drivers are high altitude commuters in the USA, because if they're driving all over the USA, they're going to very high altitudes. So there's some very high altitude places in the USA where truck drivers would go to, and high altitude. Diseases associated with high altitude sickness are acute mountain sickness, chronic mountain sickness, also known as Mung's disease, McGee's disease, altitude hypersensitivity, coronavirus, COVID-19, long COVID, pulmonary hypertension, sleep apnea, hypoxic organ damage, brain disease, heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, liver disease, gastrointestinal disease, chronic fatigue, mental illness, so that's this book, hypoxia, mental illness, chronic fatigue, malnutrition, food sensitivities, light sensitivities, weakened immune system, so that's a big one for COVID-19. If you've got a weakened immune system, you may not do well with COVID-19. Tumours, cancers, suicides. So I've got a growing group of people I've worked with in high altitude astronomy who are doing tumours, cancers, and suicides. So I'm on this list. I'm in the tumour category. I developed a tumour in my right knee, and I had to get it removed. I used my sick time, and then when I returned to work to carry on with my job, I found that triggered harassment of me. So this was at the WMKEC Observatory. They started taking me into harassment meetings for my voluntary resignation when I returned to work after having tumour surgery. So that they didn't like me having a tumour removed from my knee, and that was specifically talked about in those harassment meetings. So in the WMKEC Observatory, where I'm standing, you may get harassed if you take sick time for your tumour removal, which may kill you if it doesn't get removed. I found that very interesting. Premature death. Yeah, there's a growing list of people that are having premature deaths in astronomy. And it's not just astronomy, it happens on a lot of mountain peaks. People go up there, they get very sick, they get evacuated to hospital, and they die. So premature death is definitely a feature of altitude, and it's definitely a feature of high altitude astronomy. There's a growing list of premature death people. And they die weird deaths. Yeah, kind of weird. Okay, let's finish off. If you have sea level adapted genetics, then it is in your best interest to live and work near sea level. So that was the mistake I made. I didn't know this, that I had sea level adapted genetics from Liverpool, UK, and I probably grew up within about 50 to 100 feet of sea level. So I'm definitely a sea level adapted human. My ancestors are definitely sea level adapted humans. And then I went into this toxic high altitude industry that I had no adaptation to. So this person here probably has a bunch of genetic adaptations to altitude in them right now. And that's probably part of this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue. So these people with the sea level adapted genetics on top of Mauna Kea, almost at 13,800 feet, they're probably all starting to genetically adapt to that environment. And I am of a belief that those genetic adaptations are part of altitude sickness. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and I wish you the very best of health. Thank you.